Hello, women's hockey fans. The PWHL Finals matchup for this year is set, and it is a battle of the two gritty teams. Let's preview the Ottawa Charge against the Minnesota Frost and give you some updates on what we know about the expansion draft coming up on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report.
This is the Women's Hockey Report presented by Locked On NHL, your weekly look at the world of women's hockey. From the PWHL to the international stage, it's the Women's Hockey Report on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello, women's hockey fans. Welcome to another edition of the Women's Hockey Report as part of the Locked On NHL channel, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. And we are excited to bring some women's hockey to the Locked On Podcast Network here. And it's PWHL Finals coming up, the Walter Cup. Will it go to the reigning champion, or will we have a new champion? We'll talk about that on today's episode. Rachel, how are you doing today? Let's do a vibe check before we go into women's hockey talk.
Yeah, it's so weird. This is going to be so super hypocritical, and I understand that from jump. But, we've been sort of begging for information about expansion draft and how that was going to work and everything. We got the information, but also I find it deeply uncomfortable to have to talk about it in the middle of the PWHL Finals conversation as well. Like, we're supposed to be talking about Ottawa and Minnesota and who's going to win. And now we have to worry about who's not going to be on the team next year at the same time. And I don't love that. I don't love that feeling. But I think, we wanted it. We got the information. So that's where we are.
Well, I'm sure women's basketball fans are saying, hold my beer, because that is the name of the game. And speaking of basketball, my vibe check is that I got to see the banner raising and the ring ceremony for the New York Liberty. And that was awesome. It was great to be back home. They got a win over the Vegas Aces. So I'm always pretty excited about that. So yeah, our vibe check, we just try to check in with each other before hopping into the hot topics of women's ice hockey, which is all about the PWHL Finals right now. The Walter Cup again will be crowned once again. Minnesota against Ottawa. The third and fourth place teams, Rachel, make their way to the finals. We are going to preview that, but first we have to let you know how the second team got there. We talked about Minnesota. We talked about that win over Toronto. We're going to talk about Minnesota again. All right. We see the comments, folks. We're going to talk about Minnesota. Don't you fret. Don't you fret. But for now, we have to talk about how the Ottawa Charge once again sent Montreal packing. Couldn't get out of the first round. This is a little bit of a bugaboo so far for Toronto and Montreal. And this year it was Ottawa taking the charge, going all the way to the final.
I will give you that one, Erica. I will absolutely give you that one. I think, this was just an all-around solid effort by the Ottawa Charge, knowing exactly how to play against this Montreal Victoire team. They, from start to finish, played a very strong team defense. Montreal only had 20 shots on goal in the game. And I think, that was just really the name of it there, is that their defensive structure and getting those matchups they wanted. And the Victoire don't really have, to be honest, the full depth to run four lines solidly. And so for Ottawa, it was really handling 2.5 lines of Montreal through the game. And they were able to execute on it this time around instead of having to stress about it, which maybe they would have earlier in the regular season, but not in the playoffs.
Yeah, I think it's interesting you talk about the depth here, because I do want to talk about that. And if there are similarities, differences between each semifinal series now coming into the final with Ottawa and Minnesota regarding depth, regarding, who are some key players, but also some X factors. Or another way of putting it is, who are the players that really need to step up? I think we've seen that gradual progression for Ottawa. And to your point with regard to Montreal, it seemed like it was a handful of players that they were relying on. How much of that is when you play with, we talk about this in the NHL every once in a while, you play with a certain player and everyone is expecting that player, Marie-Philippe Poulin, maybe a Laura Stacey, and Renee Desbiens, I mean, just to name three, right? But those are the three key players for Montreal. Everyone knows that. And so if you can make life as difficult as possible for those three players, is there enough for Montreal? Do they have that firepower? So that's a really interesting question. And I think, again, something I want to focus on when it comes to the Ottawa now taking on Minnesota, because I think there are some interesting wrinkles that the finals matchup will bring with that regard. And this Ottawa team, it seems like, have they exercised their demons, Rachel? So much of the regular season was us talking about how they have been inconsistent, and they have consistently bucked that trend in the postseason.
Yeah, and I think it's just so interesting how they came away from that quadruple overtime game. I think there's a lot of teams that could have just withered away after going through that kind of experience. And Ottawa comes back with two stellar defensive performances in a row to win that series, with the 1-0 shutout in game 3. And then, a low scoring battle in game 4 to win it out. Plus, they managed to get their own depth players going. You see Rebecca Leslie and Emily Clark scored for Ottawa in that game. Neither one of them had scored in the playoffs yet. And that's like the extra mile you have to go to win in a playoff situation.
Yeah, indeed. And that's going to be huge when it comes to how this upcoming series really falls. And we're going to get into that shortly. Before we move on, just a bit of news that we got here. We'll talk about Phillips, Heise, and Hughes coming up, but those three are your 3 stars of the week. And, Gwyneth Philips, we've been talking about Gwen Phillips and what she's meant for the Charge here. 26 saves in that 1-0 win that you referred to, 19 in the 2-1 win. I love how they used the chosen team in the write-up. That was really funny to me. Second star was Taylor Heise, got that overtime game-winning goal to advance Minnesota, and Gabby Hughes, also of the Ottawa Charge, and a team high 4 shots and collected a playoff point. So again, first career playoff point there. So Rachel, also going to something that you mentioned, but let us continue on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report, talking about what everyone really wants to know about, and that is the matchup in the finals, Ottawa versus Minnesota. We've got that coming up for you on today's episode.
Looking for a snack that's both delicious and nutritious? Crack into a good source of protein with Wonderful Pistachios. Wonderful Pistachios is one of the highest protein nuts, and each 1 ounce serving has 6 grams of protein, giving you over 10% of your daily value. Plus, they're packed with fiber and better for you unsaturated fats to help keep you feeling full longer. And personally, I love the no shells variety because I'm super lazy, and it's the perfect grab and go snack for busy days. I don't have to do the shelling while I'm at my desk, while I'm working. And I recently reloaded my supply of the Wonderful Pistachio sea salt and vinegar no shells variety, which is my personal favorite flavor, but all of them are so good and healthy too. Wonderful Pistachios is a complete protein, providing all 9 essential amino acids. These little green wonders pack a protein punch. So get snacking and get cracking with the snack that packs a protein punch. Visit wonderfulpistachios.com to learn more.
And thanks as always for joining us here on the Women's Hockey Report. We are usually coming to you on Saturday mornings, but we didn't want to miss out on being able to preview the finals, which is what we are going to do right now. So If we look at these two teams in the head-to-head in the regular season, Rachel, we see that they're split 3-3. It's a split decision here. That being said, Minnesota more goals for than Ottawa, 18-14 is the breakdown there. What would you say about the regular season when it comes to the matchups between these two teams? Do you think momentum, whoever won the last game, does that matter? Is it whoever scored the most goals? Does that matter? If you're a Minnesota fan, you'd love to hear that Minnesota owns both of those. But does the regular season matter when you have two teams that had to claw their way into the playoffs? Rachel?
I don't know that it does. I think that, especially given how the semifinal series went and, looking how each team kind of clinched their playoff spot and then won their semifinal round, I think that's really more important at this point in the playoffs. And I think we saw that from Minnesota last year in the playoffs as well, that kind of the regular season, you just wipe that slate clean and kind of start over and figure out head to head, how do you match up against this team, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that you're probably right. I think both teams are feeling confident. We know for sure Ottawa, Carla McLeod, we heard, said that every day is the challenge or the task at hand is to get better. There's that phrase, you get 1% better each day. And she has really instilled that in her team. So she was responding to a question about if she felt her team had peaked. And she's like, well, we don't subscribe to that.
Know.
We are aiming to get better every day. So I love that she redirects questions. She's like, no, we're not, don't write that. We're not winning that. So let's talk about key playoff numbers then. If the momentum in the playoffs perhaps means more than the regular season head to head. Now, obviously, Rachel, these teams have not played each other in the playoffs, which is why they're in the finals. But Minnesota has the top 6 goal scorers in all of the postseason. Now, there are a few players that are toggled to have 4 goals, but none of them are from Ottawa. We'll talk about that in a minute. But special teams, Minnesota also has the best power play from all of the postseason teams. So of the 4 teams that were playing in the playoffs, Minnesota has the best power play at a 55.6% clip. Again, their top 6 goals, they have the top 6 goal scorers. They've gotten pretty, significant wins, lots of goals, and from multiple people. It's not like, Kendall Coyne-Schofield getting a hat trick every time out. They're getting a lot of, different goal scorers. Now, if you look at what Ottawa brings to the table, the most goals that they have are Jenner and Clark both have 3 goals in the postseason, but they have the best goaltender, at least by the numbers. Gwyneth Philips, a 1.14 goals against average and a 9.56 save percentage in 4 games, tied for most games played in the postseason with Renee Desbiens, who, of course, she took on head-to-head in the semifinals. If you look at, though, goaltending for Minnesota, this is a really interesting topic because throughout the regular season and even in the postseason, Rachel, we've seen that the Frost has deployed both Maddie Rooney and Nicole Hensley. Now, is that going to be a benefit for Minnesota? Is that we really only have seen Phillips a weakness for Ottawa? I mean, what is your take? Let's start specifically on goaltending and maybe then go to some of the other postseason stats.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see Minnesota use both goaltenders because that is not a traditional hockey thing to do, right? Yeah. You go with the hot goaltender and you stick with them until there's some sort of major issue or collapse, right? Mm-hmm. Or injury or something. Like that is the only reason why you swap out goaltenders usually in hockey. And for them to have used both of them, each have gotten 2 games here. You look at those 2 goaltenders, and Nicole Hensley has the much better, goals against average. Yeah. Maddie Rooney, won both the games. So because one of them was an extremely high scoring game, right? Just overall. So, it's hard to say which one was better in the semifinals here, but I do think that having them even out the minutes, and I don't know who I would pick, and I think having that indecision is a little bit of a problem in and of itself, like having to make that choice. Whereas Ottawa, it's Phillips. Like there's no question about it, right?
Yeah, for sure. That's interesting because I think it can also go the other way. I mean, let's keep it real. When you get to the finals, I mean, the scouting sheet is long, right? There's plenty of film on both of these teams. So, you have that when it comes to Phillips, and the enemy is Phillips, right? And so Minnesota's game plan is easier in that respect. They are only expecting to see one goaltender, barring something that we don't even want to talk about on the podcast, right? So think about it from the other perspective. If Ottawa now has to game plan for two goaltenders, how does that impact things? Now, again, these teams have seen each other 6 times in the regular season. They know that this is what Minnesota does. And so you have to just be very particular every game and make sure you know who's in net. Make sure your coaching staff in particular knows who's in net. So I think it can go either way. I
think that's fair.
Yeah. There's value in having no choice. This is what we're doing, right? We didn't have a choice that Montreal picked us, right? A la Carla McLeod.
Right.
This is what we're doing. We're not making it a big thing. This is how it is. These are the rules. Them's the breaks, right? And so, I think it can go either way with Minnesota, though, having goaltenders that have those repetitions, whether it's because you want to mix things up or, again, because one of your goaltenders can't go, knowing that there's that confidence, right? And we talked about it also before, knowing that your players in front of your goaltender know how to play in front of both goaltenders, and that they're not learning on the fly, so to speak. So I think it's going to be interesting if and how goaltending, particularly on the Minnesota side, knowing they have those choices, is that something that becomes a storyline here? Because we know Gwyneth Philips is the story in net for Ottawa, for sure. That brings me to some other things, though, Rachel, with regard to these two teams. I think that when we talked about Montreal earlier in the episode, we were talking about, do they have enough of a 1, 2, 3, 4 punch? And I wonder what your thoughts are on the head-to-heads with these lineups here, because I think that each team has a strong line, and I think that there is depth, but it's not necessarily the same lines as they've been rolled out. Like we're just, I'm just going on the last game. So on May 14th, we had Taylor Heise centering Coyne Schofield and Michaela Cava. That's a power line for sure for Minnesota, right? I mean, that's not a question.
Right.
We know that that's the line that's expected to perform. Then you go McQuigg or Panic centering McQuigg and Zumwinkle. You've got Petrie centering Britta Curl and Denisa Krishova, and then Shepers with Himlarova and Knoll. For me, I think it's your top line there for Minnesota for sure. And for me, I think the line that I'm expecting to see with probably the most consistency after that first line is honestly that third line with Krishova and Britta Curl. I'm not sure. I mean, Kelly Panic was huge also in the series to get them the win in the series. And I don't know. This is off of my eye test as well. So let me know what you think, Rachel, here. Of those 4 lines, rolling those 4 lines, who do you think Minnesota is relying on the most going into this series against Ottawa?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that they're looking for that top line to come through. And I would say especially Taylor Heise, who, finally did come through, but had been, I think, a little bit more in the background earlier in the semifinal series. But I do think that third line is the line that has to come through, because I think they're going to get the more favorable matchups against that extremely strong Ottawa Charge defense that we've already talked about. And so if they can jump on those opportunities, that's where I think they're going to find success. And if they can get an errant goal here and there from their second line and their fourth line, that will only put them over the top.
Absolutely. It's like you read my mind there, because the next factor for me is definitely Denisha Kryshova. Now, here's a few things. Kryshova, we know from her history, even before the PWHL, is a goal scorer, can be an elite level goal scorer, really hard nose. Both of these teams, in just looking at their shot charts, we don't have a lot of advanced analytics for the PWHL, not yet. We're hoping that continues. But shout out to Beyond the Scoreboard, I think is the name of this website. I'll link it in the show notes. But so we have some advanced stats here, and looking at the shot charts, both of these teams really can light it up close in the crease. So, and Kryshova for Minnesota, along with that Heise line, absolutely can do that. For me, another thing about Kryshova is, she's playing against her head coach, her national team head coach, and some of her teammates with Team Czechia. So there's a familiarity there, and there's a couple of players from Czechia on Minnesota as so, I wonder how much does that, is it a la A League of Their Own, you tell them to throw the high ones.
Did she drop the ball, Erica?
Oh my gosh, I ran into such a great analysis of A League of Their Own. And I mean, I could literally spend the rest of the episode breaking that down, but we'll do that on our next women's sports podcast that we bring to the Locked On Podcast Network. Right. But so let's go to Ottawa then. Based on their lines, and these haven't changed very much. We talked about Toronto. They were really mixing up their lines in a blender, so to speak, but I think for the most part we've seen this be consistent. So we've got Hughes centering Clark and McMahon, Darkangelo centering Vanishova and Jenner, that's the second line, Mrazova with Leslie and Mexner, and then Vasco with Serdachny and Bach there. Now, we talked about that second line for Ottawa. Defensive minded for sure. That's your muscle for real. There's a lot of muscle on that second line.
There is. And I think that's like the 1-2 punch that this Ottawa Charge team has, is that second line, because to your point, they do provide an excellent two-way game, but we have seen Cheyenne Darkangelo light it up on the scoreboard. Yep. We have seen Teresa Vanisheva light it up on the scoreboard at times. And then Brianne Jenner has come through recently, team captain. And so I think that line is going to be key for Ottawa in this matchup. And, I think the first line is going to have to produce for sure. But it's that two-way game of the second line. Like, that is going to be critical, because if they can get those matchups, especially when they're at home and have, the last change, like, they're the ones that can shut down Minnesota's top scorers.
Yeah, I think that second line, if you needed line to go overtime, that's probably who they lean on. To your point, though, that does put a lot of I think there's a lot of opportunity. I mean, we saw Hughes, be a star of the game. Emily Clark was coming up big in that last game for Ottawa. For me, a little bit of an X factor perhaps then is the third and fourth line for this Ottawa Charge team. I do think that Victoria Bach is an interesting player here, because I don't think that she's completely found her true stride with Ottawa just yet, but is a player individually, that we know can perform, and we've seen do so. But could Victoria Bach have a really standout game? I think you absolutely need Vanisheva and Mrazova to come through. Vanisheva, the leading goal scorer for this Ottawa Charge coming into the playoffs, and so gonna get a lot of attention, rightfully so, from the opponent. And can Vanishova figure a way to work through that, whether it's being more of a playmaker, bringing that physicality that she's known for? Although we have it on record, Rachel, she's not dropping the gloves anytime soon now that she knows what the fine is, and she's not trying to punch nobody in the cage. But jokes aside, I think for me, those are the X factors there. The key player, I mean, do we need to go there again? It's Philips, right?
Of course. I mean, yeah, and this is where with these two teams, like both of these teams can be high scoring, right? But with the defense of Ottawa and the goaltending of Philips, like, is this the brick wall that Minnesota runs into? It could be, but that's where Minnesota then has to counter with that high-octane offense and keep it fast and loose. Keep it a north to south game, because if this game goes east-west, that's Ottawa's game. And I think that's going to be the key here, ultimately.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And, if you want to really get out, because Ottawa is also a fast team.
Right.
They can go stride for stride. I mean, we saw that that's a lot of how they were able to keep Marie-Philippe Poulin in check, is because they had players that could, on a back check, catch up to MPP. And we saw that a few times. So if that's how Minnesota wants to play, then I think that means they have to be responsible with the puck in their own end. And you're relying on your defenders, because again, shot charts say that both of these teams are going to get in tight. So as Minnesota, as either team, because both teams are fast and can play that breakout game for sure, both teams are going to have to really be solid in moving the puck out of the zone in a controlled manner as much as possible to try and free up some of their really fast forwards to attack the net. And so you've already alluded to it, but we're going to end in a way. I love doing predictions in a different way, remixing it a little bit. I mean, we can sit here as the experts behind our microphones and say all kinds of things, right? But how do we think things are going to play out? What do we think each team has to lean into to be able to hoist the Walter Cup? Minnesota looking for the opportunity to do it for the second time. And of course, Ottawa in their first playoff run getting to the finals. So let's start with the contenders, right? The challengers in Ottawa. The Ottawa Charge, Rachel, will win the Walter Cup in 2025 if...
I mean, I think I just said it. Like, if they can keep Minnesota's high-octane offense and that north-south game from being successful, drive them to the outside like they did with Montreal, and then have a counterattack of their own, to your point. I think that's the formula for Ottawa right there.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I mean, simply put, they got to play like they have throughout the first round of the playoffs, right? It requires excellent goaltending, which again, you and I have also already talked about. We talked about the need for Vanishova and Mrazova to step up. They have to get on the board. They have to. That's like a non-negotiable. Another thing I will say with regard to whether we see Rooney or Hensley, they have to get to Minnesota's net early and often. I think Ottawa is their best version of themselves when they get their work done early. I think that they can obviously hold a lead, at least in the playoffs, right? We've seen that. And I think when they have some momentum, whether they're scoring or not, but when they have some momentum early, you can throw that first punch. I like that. So now it's time to go to Minnesota. Minnesota will win their second Walter Cup if, and I have this as a question mark, Rachel, but it goes back to, again, something we've already said, goaltending. They have the luxury of running with two solid choices. And so it's a matter of who will own the crease. And maybe the answer is both of them. But I really think that it's a little bit of an X factor. It's a little bit of a necessity. And it's absolutely what I think makes them the more mysterious team coming in. And I think they can use that to their advantage. So for me, if they can get solid performances from both of their netminders and have that luxury of playing both of them at will, Ken Clee said we're going to need both of them. And I think that's right, because all things being equal, having an extra elite level goaltender that is playoff ready, I do think because these two teams are so well matched everywhere else, could absolutely work in Minnesota's favor. But what about you, Rachel? Minnesota wins if?
I think if their blue line continues to get on the board the way that they have, because I think that when you look at those top 6, point getters in the playoffs being from Minnesota, you have Lee Steckline, who we've talked a lot about on this show. You have Sophie Jakes, who has played wonderfully in the postseason thus far and the regular season too. But I think those two in particular, they each have 6 points in the playoffs thus far. And that's the X factor for that team, because if Ottawa is busy trying to shut down the forwards, that's where the defenders have a chance to take their shots, and they do. That's the thing. You look at Sophie Jakes has 11 shots on goal so far in the playoffs, and so that to me is the X factor for Minnesota, because that'll knock Ottawa off their game, because they won't know what to do structurally if Minnesota's defense starts coming through offensively.
That's a really fantastic point. And we haven't really seen the Ottawa defenders activate in that way. And I think there are some that can do that, but also they're without Jinsey Rose. We're expecting that to be the case. Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And I'm like low-key mad I teed you up to talk about the defenders, Rachel. I was so focused on goaltending, but I love it. All right. Oh, so go ahead.
No, that was it. I was just, well, pat on my own shoulder there.
As you should. All right. Well, those are our thoughts heading into game 1 of this matchup. And that is going to be coming to you later tonight. Ottawa is hosting the first 2 games at 7 p.m. Eastern today, Tuesday, May 20th, and then Thursday, May 22nd, also at 7 Eastern time. Then we switch to Central time for games 3 and 4, 4 and 5, or 4, game 4 if necessary, of course, but those will both be at Xcel Energy Center, games 3 and 4, Saturday, May 24th, 4 p.m. Central time, 5 p.m. Eastern, and Monday, May 26th, if necessary. I do think we're getting at least 4 games in this series for sure. I think we go the distance, to be honest. But
I hope we do, because it's more fun for us.
Oh God, I know, right? We'll sneak in another episode here. It'll be fantastic. And then game 5, if necessary. The latest that we will know who wins the Walter Cup is Wednesday, May 28th. That is back in Ottawa. So a 7 p.m. puck drop Eastern time. Coming up next, as Rachel mentioned in our vibe check, we have to split our attention between this epic matchup in the finals and what we know is coming for expansion and the entry draft. So let's talk about what we know, what we're thinking there, coming up on today's episode of the Women's Hockey Report. The hot topic for the PWHL, in addition to the playoffs, has obviously been expansion, Rachel. We have been waiting, we were waiting on an announcement of an announcement, and then we got the announcement about Vancouver, and then we're waiting on the next announcement that we knew was coming because of some interweb leaks. And so we know Vancouver, Seattle. But what we didn't know until recently, Rachel, is how things would fare in the first ever expansion draft for the PWHL. Let's let the folks at home know, what do we know about the expansion draft? And we'll even get into some questions that we have.
Yeah, this is bizarro land, and it's absolutely cutthroat, brutal in terms of this process that the league has set up for the expansion, because not only do we have an expansion draft, but we have an expansion signing period, which is out of left field, in my opinion. But, I think you expect an expansion draft, but the upshot is each existing team is going to lose 4 players when all is said and done. And they can only protect 3 players up front, only 3, which is crazy to even whittle that down
That's
to begin with. Those lists are due June 3rd at noon Eastern, and those protected players have to be under contract for next season or have their rights held. Because you remember when a player is drafted, you get 2 years of rights holding. So, for instance, for the New York Sirens, a player like Sarah Fillier would follow under that rule because she still has 1 more year of rights for the Sirens, even though she was only on a 1-year contract.
Right.
So, all of that being said, I think, that is interesting. And then once a team loses 2 players total, in whether it's via a signing or it bleeds over into this expansion draft, then they get to add another player to the list. But obviously 2 of their players are already gone. So they're going to have to have a lot of what if scenarios under that. And then we get this expansion draft where after the signing period where they can sign up to 5 players, that's when teams get filled up to a 12 player list. And then we go into the entry draft, which is how they'll complete their 23 player roster. But this is going to be a bloodbath across the board. And there are going to be a lot of broken hearts amongst fans from existing teams. That is for sure.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I just have so many questions, including, and I feel like I've been alluding to this, Rachel. I have never personally experienced, and we might actually have this in the W next year with Toronto and Portland, if I'm not mistaken, coming in. I've never personally experienced multiple teams coming in and having expansion drafts. We have to talk to our NWSL friends for that, because this has happened to them for sure. And it was a thing to behold from the sidelines. That just makes for a lot of, like you said, chaos with when it comes to the rosters as they are constructed at the end of the regular season. And of course, among the 2 teams we're going to see in the finals. I can't imagine that the players that are protected initially are far from the players that were signed for each of the existing 4 teams, with regard to kind of I don't think they were calling it, but it's effectively like a franchise tag, right?
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, and also, so Rachel, I was thinking about this because the language was, I wasn't completely clear, but you mentioned like a Sarah Fillier, right? But if I recall, like Sarah Nurse, who was it? Sarah Nurse, Brianne Jenner is among those. Kendall Coyne-Schofield, obviously they don't all play for the same team, but they're among those players that were signed. Lee Steckline, but those were 3-year contracts, right? So does that mean that they are exempt as kind of those franchise tags? No, right?
No,
Which is
because they released the lists. And all of those players are on the list of eligible players to be protected by the existing teams. There are so many questions because you have that question. Right. You have there's no positional protection question. So like once you lose a goalie, you can't lose another goalie, for instance. Mm-hmm. Not in the rules.
Yeah.
So you could potentially lose both your goalies if you don't protect at least one of them.
Right.
So that's going to factor into the decision making for these teams for sure. The other question I have is just the contracts in general. So at this signing period, it's not clear if the teams are just like porting their existing contracts over to the new team, or is this a free agency like period where the players have a choice even and say, I want to now sign for Seattle and I will make a different amount of money for a different number of years potentially than I had on my existing contract. Right? So like there's so many questions that are coming up with these details that we don't know the answer to.
Right. Because, having your rights held versus being on contract for a particular year at a set amount, those are 2 different things, right?
Right.
And so, yeah, that's a really great question, because on the one hand, you would assume, all right, things would just roll over. Like I would, this is a player that was on contract and effectively they're being traded through an expansion draft, right? And, what does that officially look like, because again, in the WNBA, they're allowed to sign or select in an expansion draft just one out of the entire expansion draft, one UFA. And so by design, that UFA is they had their rights, because it goes by who your rights were in the last season. And so if you're a UFA, your last contract officially ended. I'm thinking of Monique Billings, right, who's now with Golden State. But she would have to did renegotiate with Golden State because she was a free agent. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting little caveat and wrinkle here, because obviously that's going to impact the teams who have a player now off of their books, right?
Right.
And then
right now, yeah. And are there going to be like backroom deals made saying, hey, we signed this player of yours, so we're going to do a little wink and nod in the entry draft and trade you a pick as compensation? Like, what's going on here? We also don't know.
Wild West.
Yeah, we don't know the order yet of the expansion draft. We do know in the entry draft that the Sirens are definitely picking first, but after that, TBD where Seattle and Vancouver fit in. But there will be 48 picks total in that draft with 6 rounds. So we obviously know that not all those players are going to make it to the league because of the limited space now. But like, I just think that there's so many possibilities. And we do know that you can only sign up to 5 players during this signing window. So, there is a max out here, but, with the salary cap, like how is this going to affect everybody? Yeah, I just think it's crazy. This thing is going to be crazy.
It's a lot. It's a lot. We will be busy in the off season for sure. And we're recording prior to Jana Hefford and Amy Shear having media availability, but they will be speaking ahead of game 1 today. And I'm sure a lot, if not all and more of these questions will be asked, and we'll see what the answers are. If we get them, we will keep you updated on the Women's Hockey Report. The last thing, and we're not going to get into this too deeply because we do have a little bit of time, but before or I should say right after we recorded, Rachel, our last episode, wouldn't you know, the draft eligibility list dropped. You did some great reporting a couple of episodes ago about players that we knew because they elected to share on social media who was and was not going to be in the draft. But for me, we see some veteran players on this list. I mean, I recognize names like Ali Thunstrom, Rachel Yanis, Shayna Edwards, I thought was also an interesting name to see on the list. And then Miri Räisänen, a Finnish goaltender as well here. So we do have that list out. We will talk about that a little bit more. But we want to get to the Walter Cup Finals starting tonight, Rachel. It will be Ottawa hosting Minnesota for game 1 and game 2.
Right. And I do want to mention, we will be giving our who we would protect lists and who we think they'll protect comparison lists on a later show. Gotta let it marinate. Gotta get these clarifying questions answered first, but we will 100% be doing that very soon.
Absolutely. All of the things. They're keeping us busy for sure. There's no rest for the women's sports reporter and fan, but we knew that coming in, so we're glad to be here. But for Rachel Donner, Erica L. Ayala, another episode of the Women's Hockey Report in the books. Make sure that you are subscribed to the Locked On NHL channel. That's where our show lives for right now, but look for the purple icon. That's how you know it's the Women's Hockey Report. And of course, you can follow us on TikTok at women's_hockey_report. We will catch you in between this series when it shifts over to Minnesota. Until then, enjoy your day. Take some deep breaths and, just embrace your favorite merchandise for now. Because fact is that your roster is going to get rocked ahead of next season. But hey, that's what expansion brings. All right, folks, enjoy game 1, and we will catch you on the next episode. Peace out, everybody.